I'm Robert Adam. I live in Shirley Center, Massachusetts. I have been an educator in historic trades and historic preservation for the last 40 years, and continue to do that on a limited basis with lectures and workshops at various places, from North Bennett Street School to Eastfield Village in upstate New York, and work as a consultant for museums and other preservation organizations.
I guess first, can you just tell me a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Well, right now I'm trying to be retired. I'm in my 70th year, and that was my goal, to actually be retired. But what my career has been in education. Like you, I was once a student at Fitchburg State, and frankly was not inspired by it, and was in the industrial arts program, and went to teach before I finished my degree, and never finished my degree, but have been teaching really ever since. Have taught both in vocational schools and in private trade schools. I taught for, up until 10 years ago, I taught for almost 30 years at a place called North Bennett Street School in Boston, which is a trade school for adults. It's actually one of the oldest trade schools in the United States. And when I was there, I started a program in historic preservation carpentry. And that program continues. I'm still an advisor there for that program. I've always been interested in woodworking, and sort of trained early on as a cabinet maker doing antique restoration. But because we lived in an old house, ended up fixing the old house and found out that there was more money working as a carpenter than there was as doing furniture restoration. And so that's really been what I've done beyond teaching. That's been my occupation for the last 40 odd years. Teaching was the thing that ended up sort of paying the bills on a regular basis. So that's where I am today. In the last 10 years, I've been involved with restoring a house in the next town over in Harvard, which was supposedly the oldest house in Harvard, dating from 1717. That project has been an interesting sort of end of career project for me. I had a client that lived on the West Coast, lived in Portland, Oregon, was only out here 2 weeks a year, and was good enough to let me do pretty much whatever the house needed. And so we have pretty much a museum quality restoration that's gone on with this house. And we just recently, this past weekend, had an open house inviting over 120 people from the local historical society and other friends to come and see the house.
What originally got you interested in doing carpentry work?
Well, when I was a kid in high school, when I was, I guess, probably a sophomore in high school, I was always interested in woodworking, and had woodworking in as a junior high program, and had some spare time in my schedule as a sophomore, and decided to take wood shop. And the man who taught that program, that class, was a guy named Billy Hood. His last name was spelled Houde, but pronounced Hood. And he invited me one time in the fall, just about this time of the year, to come and wash storm windows at his house. And I came over and to this faraway place. I grew up in Littleton, not too far away from here, and came all the way to Shirley, which seemed like the end of the world to me at age 14, and didn't wash windows, but that day spent the day in the shop with them. He and his wife had a business doing what's known as stenciled furniture, which is decorating furniture. It's early 19th century furniture styles, Hitchcock chairs and Salem rockers and that kind of thing. And so I spent the day working with him and scraping the paint off a chair. And at the end of the day, my father picked me up to go home and said, "Well, how'd it go, son?" And I said, "Well, I never want to go back there again," because I could hardly open my hands for holding this cabinet scraper in my hand. Well, as it turns out, I did go back, and I never looked back. I ended up living there as a young married person, taking over the business and so forth. And so that was what really got me into doing the kind of woodworking and so forth. They lived in an old house, and subsequently I lived there as well. And that was in Shirley Village. We're in Shirley Center, which is the sort of agricultural center of the town. Shirley Village was the sort of mill and industrial center of the town. And but we lived in a nice old tavern there, an 1820s tavern. And so I got very much interested in not only antique furniture, but also antique houses. And so it was the houses that ended up being the sort of the track that I took. But all through that, as a young married person and into later years, I've always taught someplace, and that was being able to teach allowed me to have my summers off and then do sort of other things, do other preservation kinds of work and so forth.
That's cool. And you said you taught a program about preservation carpentry. Can you talk a little bit about what's involved with preservation carpentry?
Well, yeah, I've actually taught two programs. The first program that I taught, I started off teaching junior high kids. It was my first teaching job in I don't know, 1970 or 71. And did that for a couple of years here in Townsend, Massachusetts. And then I had been teaching at the local vocational school in Westford, Mass, Neshoba Tech, and got a job there in the mid-70s through a what was known as a bicentennial grant. 1976 was the bicentennial year, and the federal government put a lot of money into various programs, and vocational education was being very much supported back then. It was sort of in its infancy as we know today. So I taught the first federally funded restoration program and on a secondary level there at Neshoba Tech, and did that for a number of years. And then went to teach at North Bennett Street School. Thought I was going to be there for just a year or two. I was teaching actually a carpentry program there, and gave my notice about this time of the year. My second year, said, well, this is really going to be my last year. And they said, well, we'd really, like to keep you and so forth. And I said, well, this is not really what I want to do. And then the director asked me, well, what is it that you want to do? I said, well, I do historic preservation work. So they said, well, write something up and let's see if we can start a program in that. And that's what we did. We worked for the next more than 2 years before we started a program. It was probably by 85 that we really started a program with 6 students, and that's become we're now a number of years into that program, and it still flourishes. There are something like 30 students in it at this program at this time. And as I said, I still remain an advisor there to the program. And these are students, these are adult learners, typically people with not necessarily college degrees, but most often with college degrees that have gotten an undergraduate degree in, it could be in history, it could be in architecture, it could be in any number of things. And they've decided that they want to do something with their hands. And so we train people to work on historic buildings by going and working on historic buildings. There is a set curriculum. There's a component that is sort of in-house that is working at a bench and doing woodworking. We basically train people and presume that they know little or nothing about it and start them off in the same way you might start off a junior high or high school woodworking kind of thing, teaching people how to sharpen tools and do mostly hand tool work. And that progresses into working for other nonprofits, typically museums and historical societies, and working on historic buildings out in the field, either as group projects or individual projects. And we've been able to, because we've partnered with any number of other nonprofit organizations, because North Bennet Street School is a nonprofit. And so that was always our goal, was to be able to work with other nonprofits. And so as a result, we've been able to accomplish a number of projects for people, for organizations that otherwise would not have been done just because they wouldn't have enough funds to do it. And we basically, early on, we basically worked for free labor, and it was cost of materials. Today, the school charges a stipend for coming out to cover their costs and so forth. So it's been a successful program, and as I say, it's one that I'm still involved with, but just happy that I don't drive to Boston every day. So.
Yeah. What's a typical day for you like with the work that you do now?
Well, I get up when I want.
I like that.
Yeah, I like that too. I spent a lifetime of getting up and leaving 5 minutes earlier every year to drive into Boston, just to get there without dealing with the traffic and stuff. And so rather than getting up at 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning, I'm typically a little bit later. And just this last year, we slowed work down on our project in Harvard. We were also beginning there early in the morning because the fellow that worked with me, one of my graduates, he lived in West Newbury, and he wanted to start early to beat the traffic and so forth. So we typically start at 6:30. Now I start at 8:30, 9 o'clock, doing whatever I want to do. And most of the work that I'm doing now, although I'm still involved to a certain extent with the project in Harvard, Mass, I'm doing an accessibility project for the Shirley Meeting House, which is just not far from here on Shirley Common. And that's a nonprofit organization. And I've been involved with that really since I was 21. So it's been approaching 50 years for me now. And what we've done is, in the last 8 years, is we've restored the exterior, and now we're working on an accessibility project that we've received a grant from the Mass Development, from Mass Cultural Council's Facilities Fund, which is administered through Mass Development, which is the state's bank. It's a matching grant, and what we're doing is putting in we've put in a handicapped accessible bathroom and utility room, and we're now in the process of doing an entrance to the building. The building only has one entrance, and so we have to make that accessible. And what we're trying to do is make it accessible without looking as if it has handrails and so forth. So we're putting in an earthen ramp that will be grassed that is a very low slope, so it won't particularly change the looks of the building. So that's really what's been keeping me involved. And now that it's fall, we have about 2 acres worth of grass and leaves to take care of here, and that's why I'm concerned about my mowing machine being down for a couple of days. We do that. My wife and I travel. We just got back from Africa. We were in Africa for a couple of weeks in Botswana, looking at lions as close as from me to you. So that was really quite a trip. So we plan on doing more traveling and so forth. I am never at a lack of something to do. I always have something in my shop that I'm doing, and so always busy.
That's great. So we're in this really cool house that you've restored and expanded on. Can you talk a little bit about the work that you did on this house?
Well, this is a little Shaker house, and the Shakers were here in one of their early communities where they were here in both Shirley and in Harvard in the same what's known as bishopric. And the Shirley Shaker Village is now what it is MCI Shirley. It's the state prison there. And there are still some historic buildings there, but the Shakers closed their facility in Shirley in 1908, but in 1905 or 1906, they moved this house to a location that's up near where the current interchange for Shirley Road and Route 2 is. And this little building was to serve as a caretaker's cottage for a larger building that they had owned, something called the Brick Tavern. And the Brick Tavern was where people were always interested in seeing the Shakers and seeing what the Shakers did and what their industries were and how they worshiped and how they danced and all of that sort of stuff. But because the Shakers lived in dormitories, they had no place to put people up. And so they bought this tavern, and if someone came to visit the Shakers, they would stay there. Well, as they were closing, they realized they had to sell that property as a separate entity, and that this came up as the caretaker's cottage for that. And they moved it over the fields on rollers and so forth. So the house was moved probably 3 times and possibly 4 times. And this is going back probably 13, 14 years ago now. The people who owned the house were longtime friends, and I didn't realize that they were planning to sell it, but I had always asked them if they were interested in selling it, please keep me in mind. Well, what they ended up doing was the property that they had, which was a number of acres, was being redeveloped into multifamily duplex housing and basically moderate income housing. And unfortunately, this building, which sat right on the road, was part of what the developer deemed as his open space plan, and they were going to tear the building down. When I was at North Bennet Street School, we oftentimes did programs at various sites. There was an old house fair at the Cyclorama in Boston, and 2 women came up. One was a selectman from Lancaster, the other was on the Historic Commission in Lancaster. And they said, oh, we have this house that's going to be torn down, and, is there anything you can do to help? And so forth. And I said, well, what is the house? Where is it? And they described it and said, well, I know that house very well, and I know the owners and so forth. And I've always admired that house and wanted to, have it and move it and so forth. And they said, well, if you want it, it's yours. Well, it wasn't theirs to give away, actually. But in the next couple of weeks, the developer called me and so we ended up making a deal to move the house. And what we did was we took the roof off it to move it over the road and put it on a big trailer and moved it here. And then it took about 6 years to restore this house, and it's an interesting house. It's the only surviving gambrel roofed Shaker house, other than their meeting houses. There are several meeting houses in Canterbury, New Hampshire, and in Sabbath Day Lake, and also in Hancock, Massachusetts, that have gambrel roofed meeting houses. In fact, the one that is in Hancock, Massachusetts is actually the one that came from the Shirley Shaker village and was moved out there in the early 1960s. So this architecturally, this is the only surviving example of this gambrel roof form in buildings other than their meeting houses that exists in the Shaker Library of Architecture. And so my specialty over the years has oddly been historic windows. And I was impressed with this house because it had all of its original windows in it. And that was sort of the impetus for moving this and so forth, because it had suffered from benign neglect and had been preserved actually very well. There were layers of later additions put on it, but they were easily removed and so forth. So it was something that we decided to move. As I had mentioned earlier, we lived across the street in this little 1835 cottage, but owned this field. And I had built my shop over here. The intent was to always build a house over here. But because we're in a historic district, I wanted a historic house to sort of be the frontispiece for our new addition. And so that's really the genesis of this building. As I say, we restored this. This was never a dwelling house. This was originally an office. In Shirley, it's known as the old infirmary. I'm not sure that I would want to get sick here, because I don't think they gave anything more than an aspirin or a Band-Aid in this building. But nevertheless, that's how it's come down. And it's really a great building, and it's been a worthwhile project.
When you're doing preservation work and like carpentry work on a historical thing such as this house or such as other things that you've worked on, what are some of the things that you have to keep in mind? Like what makes that sort of work unique from, say, other sort of carpentry and stuff?
Well, there's a number of things. There are no two things that are the same. That there's always something different. That typically the philosophy we use is that whatever we do, we want to be as reversible as possible. That we want to also retain as much of the historic fabric as possible, and also replicate things using the same materials, using the same tools, using the same techniques, and so forth. And for example, when these rooms have been replastered, and they're replastered on either the original lath or on the second story, where we had to take the second story off. We made new, what's known as accordion lath, wood lath, to put it on. We did use a lighter weight plaster here. We used something known as Structuralite, just because it was quicker and and faster for us to do. In our other jobs where we've had more time, the job in Harvard, for example, all of the work we've done there is in lime plaster. When we talk about reversibility, we talk about also dating things. For example, if we're putting something on that's not going to be visible, we will screw it on with these contemporary screws, so that when someone is coming back to look at it, they'll know that these screws were from this particular period, were from 2010 or whenever, and that they'll be able to remove whatever material that we've put on in restoring something, to be able to look at the real fabric without having to destroy any of the fabric to do that. So it's been a philosophy that's worked well for us, and mostly hand tool skills, which is not to say that we don't use power tools, but most everything is finished by hand. It's all hand planed. The paint here, for example, was all made by hand with ground pigments and so forth. So, I mean, that's one end of the spectrum. And it doesn't necessarily work for everybody. But we've had the luxury of time and ability to take, to be able to do that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So the nice thing about preservation work, as I said earlier, is that there are no two things the same. There's always something completely different. And whereas contemporary carpentry work today, unfortunately, is that carpenters are installers mostly of what other people make. And they buy windows, they buy doors, they buy trim and wallboard and all of that sort of stuff. And they're attaching these to other pieces. What we do is all the material that we get comes from the sawmill. It is all milled. We mill it all. It's all custom done and hand planed and so forth. And or reusing other historic material, repurposing things as it would have been.
Yeah, I love the thing about how it's all different. You can't go out to Home Depot and buy that window frame. You have to make it. But that kind of made me wonder something, because I've done research on preservation in regards to other fields. But one of the things I've always bumped up against myself is, after a certain point of replacing parts, when is it still the original thing, and when has it just been purely rebuilt? And I was wondering, have there ever been times when you just there was too much to be done, so it wouldn't be the original thing anymore, and you couldn't do anything?
Yeah, I mean, there does come a point where you are replicating rather than preserving something. That the original fabric has gone beyond its life expectancy and has to be replaced. And so there's a couple of different philosophies that if you are replacing something, you replace it in kind, the same material, possibly made exactly the same way with the same sort of tool marks on it, and so forth. Or there is the other philosophy, and both of them are equally valid, where you actually are replacing something, you're doing it in the same size, shape, and form, and so forth, but it is clearly a replacement piece and someone can see it. It's like going to the Museum of Fine Arts and seeing a Grecian vase that has been put together from fragments where the new pieces are colored differently. And so in some instances we've done things like that, where we have replaced parts and we have purposely colored them in a way or done some way of recognizing them as new parts, so that they're not being confused with what historical material is.
Right.
So, a lot of what people call historic restoration today is really high-end remodeling. There's a lot of historic fabric that gets thrown out. Our philosophy has always been, and this is the philosophy, not just mine, but it's the National Park Service and so forth that writes preservation guidelines, is that things should be replaced if they're going to be replaced in kind. You try to keep an archive of what the original material was, so that if somebody was coming back to look in 50 years to see what that might be, they have a real example to take a look at, and that's pretty important for the scholarship about it, because it's not just the act of doing it. There is the act of sort of the part of it that is research and scholarship and so forth, and documenting what you do. Everything that we've done here, for example, when we took this house apart, all of the components were cataloged. They all had a unique tag on them, and there were drawings of each one of the facades and each one of the interior walls that showed what each component was. So each one of the baseboard components each had a number, and the little aluminum tag that was put on it had a corresponding drawing and so forth, because you end up with a bunch of parts that are in a pile, and you need to know where they all go back together with so forth. So there are some techniques that we use that just seem sort of matter of fact to me, but that are sort of unique to the preservation business in terms of keeping all the original material.
Yeah, I've actually just noticed, looking off to my right, and I'll get a shot of this later, I can see spots in the baseboard that have been repaired with new pieces of wood.
And the flooring, yes. Oh, yeah. This is a 2-inch thick floor that is rather unusual. These rooms were used. This was originally the office for the Shakers, but there were also workrooms that people made things here, and we think that this room here was possibly used as a cooper shop, as a white cooper making tubs and barrels, tubs and small barrels, not large barrels, and that the floor here was actually pinned down. If you look, you'll see some pegs coming out of the floor, some pins that was pinned down to the floor joist. And there was another layer of flooring on top of this, plus probably 3 layers of linoleum and plywood and so forth that were yet on top of that second Shaker layer. And so this is the first layer that is on here, and we've had to use what's known as Dutchman little patches to fill this out. So all of our repair work is we don't use any epoxy. A lot of people use epoxies with things. We don't use any of that. We put in real pieces of wood rather than filling holes.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I also just found it kind of interesting that that when you do replace something, and this isn't really in relation to the wood, it was more to, you said something earlier about when you replace a piece, you try and make it distinct so people know it's a modern replacement, whereas I would have thought you would have tried to make it as accurate as possible, as if it was a repair done back in the day. Well,
we do that.
Right.
There's 2 philosophies. One is there's an organization in the UK called SPAB, the Society for Preservation of Ancient Buildings, and their philosophy is very clear. They'll replace that piece of chair rail, but rather than hand planing it, they'll replace it with a machine planed finish on it, so that at first glance it looks like it's the same size and scale and so forth. But as you look at it more closely, you can tell that it's a modern piece. My philosophy here is that we take it one step further. We use the same sort of tool marks and we'll hand plane it. But if someone were ever to take this off in the back, they would know that it was a new piece. And if somebody were to look at it, really scrutinize it, they'd know that it was a new piece.
Okay.
So I mean, there's a blend of those kinds of things. As I say, where we put things together that are not going to be seen, we're always using mechanical fasteners so that it can come apart, and that. But yet, if we're using, we'll take and reuse historic nails to nail something back on, so that it looks the same way. We're not using but having said that, we also use pneumatic nails, nail guns, because there's less impact from them. Rather than banging a nail with a hammer, using a pneumatic nail has less impact, and the nails are typically thinner and more discreet.
Right, but so your philosophy is to make new pieces blend in, and so you
pretty much so, yeah.
So you can't immediately tell it's
right.
Okay, sorry, I misinterpreted a little earlier. I thought you meant that you were purposefully distinguishing stuff.
Well, in some instances, yes.
Okay.
And in other instances, we want to do a seamless repair. But for someone scrutinizing it and really looking at it, someone 100 years from now looking at it, they're going to tell where we were. We're not that good. We're not as good as somebody else.
Yeah.
The other thing is just in terms of quality of stuff, that part of our philosophy is that you try to replicate the level of workmanship that was originally done, rather than trying to make this a high style looking Georgian building. It's very much a vernacular building, and that there are mistakes in the building, and sometimes we make mistakes, and frankly, we just leave those things because that's sort of part of the getting into the headset of the person that actually did the work.
It gives it a little bit of charm, right?
Yeah.
That's cool. Are there any projects that you've done that were sort of special or unique that have kind of stuck with you until now?
Well, I think most all of the stuff that I've done, there are unique aspects to it. I mean, this was the first house that I moved whole. We've taken down a number of buildings. In fact, a couple of the buildings on our complex here were taken down and moved in pieces. I spent 2 months a couple of years ago on a 120-foot lift restoring the bell tower on the Shirley Meeting House. That was sort of an exciting time because we were up about 95 feet in the air. So that sort of sticks in my mind. I'm glad to be on the ground again. And I mean, there's a lot of things that are memorable and unique, but nothing jumps out at me as being the most unique. It's all been fun. I don't take on other projects anymore, and those projects that I do take on have to be fun. I don't want to do anything that feels like work. And I'm fortunate enough to say that most of my career, I've not really had to work for a living. I've always done some pretty interesting things and some fun things. It's not that it didn't take a lot of effort, but I was always interested in doing it. I wasn't. As a young man, the first time I quit college, I went and I worked for Raytheon for about 6 months in a drafting room, and I realized that was exactly what I didn't want to do. And so you know, I mean, those are some of the kind of jobs that you remember that make a difference, because I knew that I didn't want to be stuck in an office or something like that, like a lot of people do, and that a lot of people hate doing for the rest of their lives. And I felt that I always wanted to do something that was going to be fun, and I have. So,
that's great. Yeah. I guess just one last question: what impact do you hope your work with all this stuff has on the future?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, a lot of people are going to look at this and say, "Why would you want to do all this?" I don't know. I hope I hope that some of the work that I've done will endure. We've always tried to do things that were not quick fixes, but were long-lasting kinds of repairs or restorations. The project that we did in Harvard, the owner has thought enough to put protective covenants on it, deed restrictions, so that no one can come in and change what we've done. That comes at a cost. When I'm long gone, someone's going to come in here and they're probably going to, change some things around, and hopefully they will treat whatever we've done with some sort of respect. But this is America, goddammit. So people can do whatever they want. Hopefully they appreciate the kinds of things that we've done, and what we've tried to do is restore things for really future generations. And this building came from Fitchburg, was part of was owned by the Fitchburg Historical Society, and is the proverbial building that is, you take it down to put in a parking lot. And it actually looked a lot different. It had a story underneath it, and it really was built as a little workers' shop. And it wasn't large enough for the Historical Society to use. They've since moved to another nicer facility on Main Street. But we moved that to actually sort of hold what was an architectural archive that I had when I was in school. It's now sort of my tin shop. This house is my workshop. No, this is just a woodworking shop.
Wow.
And,
That's cool. Can you tell me about what some of this stuff does?
well, I mean, these are milling machines. This is a what's known as a jointer, and there's a little thickness planer and a table saw and a lathe, and I've got a tensioner over there, and there's a shaper and stuff. It's really the original thought was to actually expand out to there, and that's going to be a project. But I have a lot of hand planes, and these are all molding planes, 19th century molding planes. Some of the 18th century too.
Wow.
Yeah.
What are all those little things over in the corner?
There are clamps, hand screws, and bar clamps, and then there's fasteners and stuff like that. What my hope is to eventually do actually what I was trained to do, is make furniture. No.
Yeah.
But this is a place to keep the tractor now. And, in the house across the street, down I restored in the 70s and 80s. And as I said, we lived there for about 35 years. And the barn over there, the red barn, is another building that we moved. That was one of the last 18th century barns here in town. So we moved that, put a slate roof on it, that sort of thing.
It's a great big yard.
Oh, it is. And that's why I'm upset that my mowing machine isn't ready, because I've got to pick up leaves and stuff. But all the leaves haven't fallen.
Yeah.
So the slate roof on this house is that it's a graduated slate roof, that that there are larger slates at the bottom and smaller slates at the top. And this was, we'd done a lot of slate roofs. This was the only graduated slate roof that I had ever done. And this is local slate that comes from a quarry in Still River. And when you bought slate, you bought a big block of it, and they split it up into larger pieces and then smaller pieces. And so that's why it has this sort of graduated look to it.